How the opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire. The air in the Canton harbor in the year 1838 was a thick soup, brine, sewage, the tang of drying fish, and the cloying sweetness of rotting fruit. Beneath it, something else lingered, acrid and resinous, carried on the smoke from countless long-stemmed pipes. It was the smell of silver melting away, of an empire's vitality quietly burning to ash. This was the scent of the great Qing slow-motion collapse, a process not of dramatic battlefield explosions alone, but of a deep, systemic rot catalyzed by a single commodity, opium. To understand the destruction, one must first grasp the entity being destroyed. The Qing dynasty in the late 18th century was not a feeble state. It was, by most metrics, the greatest empire on earth. Ruled by the Manchu Azan-Joro clan, it had expanded China's borders to their historical zenith, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Taiwan. Its population soared past 300 million, fueled by agricultural prosperity and relative peace. Its bureaucracy, steeped in 2,000 years of Confucian tradition, governed through a complex, merit-based though deeply corrupt civil service examination system. The Qianlong Emperor 1735–1796 presided over a glittering court, a vast library of knowledge, and a realm that saw itself as the sole civilization, the central kingdom, to which all others were tributary barbarians. This was the empire that would be unmade. The mechanism of its undoing began with a trade imbalance. For centuries, the world wanted Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, and, above all, tea. By the 1760s, Britain was addicted to tea, a national habit draining its silver reserves to the Qing. The Chinese, however, wanted little from the Western Ocean devils. British woolens were useless in subtropical Canton. Clocks and trinkets were curiosities, not necessities. The Qing demanded payment in silver, creating a relentless one-way flow of bullion eastward. This was economically intolerable for British mercantilism. The British East India Company found its solution in the poppy fields of Bengal. Opium, long used medicinally in China, was now processed into a potent, smokable form perfect for recreational addiction. The company established a vast, state-sponsored narcotics production system. They sold the opium at auction to country traders, private, often ruthless merchants, who smuggled it into China on fast, armed ships. The Qing had banned opium in 1729, then again with greater urgency in 1796, but the profits were astronomical and corruption was endemic. Chinese merchants, provincial officials, and even imperial customs agents took their cut, looking the other way as chests of foreign mud were unloaded onto receiving boats at Linton Island. The effects were a physiological, social, and financial pandemic. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted, from idle Manchu bannermen and scholars to soldiers, merchants, porters, and boatmen. Silver, once flowing in, now hemorrhaged out to pay for the drug, causing drastic deflation. The copper coins peasants used for daily transactions lost value against silver, crushing the tax burden on the agrarian base, the dynasty's foundation. The state was being bled dry from the treasury while its social fabric unraveled from addiction. Into this crisis stepped a formidable and morally rigid official, Lin Zexu. Appointed imperial commissioner in 1838, Lin was a Confucian purist who saw opium as a moral poison sapping the dynasty's qi, its vital energy. His methods in Canton were systematic and devastating. He arrested Chinese dealers, confiscated smoking paraphernalia, and demanded foreign merchants surrender their stocks. He famously surrounded the foreign factories, trapping traders until they complied. In a monumental act of defiance against the global capitalist system, from June 3 to 25, 1839, Lin dissolved 21,306 chests of opium, over 1,200 metric tons, in trenches of salt water and lime, flushing the ruin into the Pearl River Delta. For Lin, this was an act of righteous reclamation. For the British, it was the destruction of private property valued at millions of pounds and a perfect casus belli. The ensuing First Opium War 1839 to 1842 was less a war than a demonstration of technological and strategic asymmetry. British steam-powered gunboats, like the Nemesis, maneuvered effortlessly against Chinese junks and shoreline batteries. Qing commanders, some brave to the point of suicide, were hopelessly outmatched. The war culminated in the Treaty of Nanjing 1842, a document of profound humiliation. It ceded Hong Kong Island in perpetuity, opened 5 treaty ports, imposed a massive indemnity, and established the principle of extraterritoriality, meaning British subjects in China were subject to British, not Chinese, law. The foundational principle of Qing sovereignty, that all within the realm were subjects of the emperor, was shattered. But this was merely the first fracture. The opium trade was now legalized. The social decay continued, compounded by a new spiritual and ideological crisis. The Unequal Treaties revealed the Celestial Empire as militarily weak. The second conflict, the Arrow War 1856 to 1860, drove the lesson home with savage finality. When Qing negotiators dared resist further demands, a joint British-French expedition marched on Beijing and burned the old summer palace Yuan to the ground, a deliberate destruction of the emperor's personal sanctuary, a psychological blow meant to eviscerate the dynasty's mystic aura. The new treaties forced the legalization of Christianity, the opening of the interior to foreign travel, and the formal acceptance of opium imports. The true measure of the opium trade's destruction, however, is seen in the cataclysmic internal rebellions it helped fuel. The Taiping Rebellion 1850 to 1864, led by the Christian-influenced Hong Xiuquan, was the deadliest civil war in human history, claiming 20 to 30 million lives. Its genesis lay in the social misery of South China, a region economically disrupted by foreign trade, filled with impoverished, displaced peasants and addicts, and governed by a Qing administration now visibly impotent against the foreigner. The opium-weakened Qing military proved incapable of stopping the Taiping advance. The dynasty was only saved by raising regional, Han Chinese armies like the Xiong Army, which in turn decentralized power away from the Manchu court. Simultaneously, the Nyan Rebellion 1851 to 1868 tore through the north, while the Pantai Rebellion 1856 to 1873 ravaged Yunnan, and the Dungan Revolt 1862 to 1877 shook the northwest. It was an era of total upheaval. While not caused solely by opium, the drug had crippled the state's financial and military capacity to respond, eroded its legitimacy, and contributed massively to the social despair that fueled these movements. The empire was not just fighting foreigners, it was consuming itself. The period of self-strengthening 1860s to 1890s that followed was a desperate, half-hearted attempt to adopt Western military technology while preserving Confucian essence. It was hamstrung by the very conditions the opium trade had created: a depleted treasury, a compromised bureaucracy, and a deep-seated suspicion of all things foreign. The opium revenue itself became a tragic addiction for the state. By the late 19th century, the Qing licensed domestic poppy cultivation, taxing it heavily to fund modernization and pay treaty indemnities. China became the world's largest opium producer, a staggering reversal from the moral crusade of Lin Zexu. The empire was now both victim and pusher, trapped in a cycle of dependency that mirrored that of its addicts. The ideological corrosion was complete. The mandate of heaven, the philosophical bedrock of imperial rule, was irrevocably broken. The Qing had failed in its most fundamental Confucian duty, to protect and nourish the people. Scholars and officials began to question not just the dynasty, but the entire imperial system. The 1895 defeat by a modernized Japan, a former tributary state, confirmed the total failure of self-strengthening. The scramble for concessions that followed saw China carved into foreign spheres of influence, a phantom of its former sovereign self. The final blows of the Boxer Rebellion 1899 to 1901 and the attendant foreign invasion were a grotesque epilogue. The Qing, under the reactionary Empress Dowager Cixi, attempted to co-opt anti-foreign sentiment it could no longer control, only to bring a second, more humiliating occupation of Beijing. The dynasty staggered on for another decade, but it was a corpse awaiting burial. In 1911, with barely a whimper, the last emperor, Puyi, abdicated. The great Qing was gone, and with it, over 2 millennia of continuous imperial rule. The opium trade did not act alone. It synergized with internal weaknesses, a rigid political structure, technological stagnation, and deep ethnic tensions between the Manchu rulers and Han majority. But it was the catalyst, the poison that entered the bloodstream of a powerful body and triggered a fatal autoimmune response. It reversed the economic lifeblood of the state, crippled its military and bureaucratic will, spawned social chaos on an unimaginable scale, and legitimized foreign predation. It transformed the Middle Kingdom from a subject of awe to an object of pity and exploitation. The destruction was not merely of a government, but of a worldview. The careful, hierarchical Confucian order, the cosmic certainty of the emperor's role, the very geography of civilization itself, all were rendered obsolete by the relentless logic of the narcotic trade and the gunboats that enforced it. The scent that hung over Canton in 1838 was the smell of an ancient equilibrium burning away, leaving behind a century of trauma, chaos, and a desperate struggle for rebirth from the ashes of the world's greatest empire. The metastasis of the malady. To speak of the Qing Empire's demise as a single event is to mistake the final, silent collapse of a rotted beam for the cause of the ruin. The Opium Wars did not kill the Qing. They administered the first, debilitating fever that allowed a chronic, metastatic disease to spread through every organ of the state. The period from the 1840s to the dynasty's end in 1911 was a protracted autopsy, revealing how the opium poison corrupted systems far beyond the smoker's couch and the customs house. The fiscal and institutional metastasis. The legalization of the opium trade after 1860 created a perverse, self-cannibalizing financial model for the Qing state. Desperate for revenue to fund suppression of the Taiping Rebellion and to pay the crushing war indemnities $21 million silver after the First War, $8 million taels after the Second, the court made a Faustian bargain. It began to actively promote and tax domestic opium cultivation. By the 1880s, China was the world's largest opium producer, with vast swathes of fertile land in Sichuan, Yunnan, and Shaanxi given over to the pale, beautiful poppy. This had a catastrophic double effect. First, it diverted land and labor from food production, contributing to localized famines and making the populace more vulnerable to price shocks. Second, it institutionalized the state's dependency on the very vice it had once vowed to eradicate. The opium suppression tax legine became a crucial source of income for provincial governors and the central treasury. Reformers who argued for genuine prohibition were quietly countered by fiscal officials who presented the ledgers. To end the opium trade was to bankrupt the state. The empire was now financially addicted, its administrative integrity sacrificed to the need for the next silver fix. This fiscal dependency accelerated the most dangerous political trend of the late Qing, the decentralization of power. The massive rebellions of the mid-century could not be quelled by the enfeebled, opium-sapped central armies, the Eight Banners and Green Standards. Instead, the court had to rely on regional militias raised by Han Chinese elites, like Zheng Guofan's Xiong Army or Li Hongzhang's Huai Army. Victorious, these generals and their bureaucratic networks retained their power and control over regional revenues, including the lucrative opium taxes. What emerged was a form of warlordism in embryo. Beijing's authority became negotiable, contingent on the goodwill of powerful provincial satraps who commanded their own troops and treasuries. The centralized, bureaucratic empire that had been the Qing's great strength was dissolving into a patchwork of semi-autonomous fiefdoms, held together by personal loyalty and the shared addiction revenue. The social and demographic cataclysm. Beyond the treasury and the barracks, the opium scourge re-engineered the very social fabric. Its impact was brutally demographic. While precise numbers are impossible, estimates suggest that by the 1880s, perhaps 10% of the adult population, tens of millions, were regular users, with a significant portion deeply addicted. This was not a leisure activity of the elite, it was a plague on the productive classes. Farm laborers smoked away their wages and strength, artisans lost the steadiness of their hands, boatmen and porters succumbed to lethargy. The family unit, the bedrock of Confucian society, was shattered from within. Addicted fathers sold family heirlooms, land, and, in the most desperate cases, their own wives and children. The heartbreaking phrase "to exchange a child for smoke" entered the vernacular. Filial piety, the supreme virtue, was inverted as sons stole from aging parents to feed their habit. The social trust and reciprocal obligations that bound villages and clans together eroded in a mist of narcotic haze. This created a vast underclass of the debilitated and destitute, a reservoir of human misery that fueled social instability. Banditry increased. Secret societies, like the Tiandihui, flourished, offering alternative structures of loyalty and profit, often intertwined with the opium distribution networks. The social capital of the empire, the complex web of relationships, trust, and shared morality that enables a society to function, was being systematically destroyed. The intellectual and psychological crisis. Perhaps the most profound destruction was metaphysical. The Qing Empire was not just a state, it was a civilization with a cosmic worldview. The emperor was the son of heaven, maintaining harmony between the human and celestial realms. The Confucian scholar official was the moral and administrative pillar of this order. Opium's triumph represented a total failure of this system. For the literati class, the trauma was existential. They witnessed their philosophy of moral governance, where virtue in leadership assured stability, proven catastrophically inadequate against the combination of foreign gunboats and a domestically grown poppy. The humiliations were not just military, but intellectual. The West, once dismissed as technologically clever but morally bankrupt, had forced its will upon the Central Kingdom. This precipitated a profound identity crisis. A generation of thinkers from the moderate self-strengtheners. Like Li Hongzhong, who advocated Chinese learning for the essence, Western learning for practical use, to the more radical reformers like Kang Yuei and Liang Qichao, began a desperate search for a new formula for survival. Opium was central to this debate. It became the ultimate symbol of Chinese weakness and Western predation. Conservative officials still saw it as a moral failing of the Chinese people. Progressive reformers began to frame it as a symptom of systemic failure, of a government too corrupt, an education system too archaic, and a national body too feeble to resist. The very discussion shifted from how to restore the Confucian order to how to build a modern nation-state strong enough to resist such impositions. This was a revolutionary shift in thinking, away from the cyclical, dynastic conception of history and toward a linear, Darwinian struggle for national survival. The failed detox and the final collapse. The empire's final, ironic attempt at redemption came with the belated and doomed new policies Xinjiang of the first decade of the 20th century, and specifically, the 1906 Imperial Edict for Opium Suppression. Driven by both international pressure, particularly from a newly moralistic America, and a genuine, last-ditch reformist zeal, the plan was remarkably ambitious: a 10-year gradual prohibition, with registration of addicts, licensed smoking dens, and the phased reduction of poppy cultivation. For a moment, it seemed to work. British India agreed to reduce exports proportionally. Provincial officials reported millions of acres of poppy land converted to grain. Public burnings of opium and pipes were staged. Yet, this push for detox came far too late. The state that attempted it was a hollow shell. The central government, bankrupt and stripped of authority after the Boxer catastrophe, lacked the funds and coercive power to enforce the policy in the provinces. Local officials, whose incomes still depended on opium legion, sabotaged the effort through performative compliance. More catastrophically, the sudden suppression drove up the price of opium, enriching smugglers and creating a new crisis for addicts who could not afford their now illegal habit. The final years of the Qing, from 1908 to 1911, were a perfect microcosm of the entire century's tragedy. A well-intentioned reform, necessitated by the original opium poison, was undermined by the very fiscal and political decay that poison had caused. When the Wuchang Uprising erupted in October 1911, it was not a mass movement of opium addicts, but of modernized army officers and revolutionary intellectuals whose worldview had been forged in the furnace of the empire's failures epitomized by the century-long struggle with opium. The dynasty fell not with a bang, but with a wary abdication, its organs long since necrotized. Epilogue: The shadow of the poppy. The destruction of China's greatest empire was, therefore, not a simple story of foreign aggression. It was a complex alchemy of external imposition and internal dissolution, where the opium trade acted as the transformative catalyst. It twisted the economy into a parasitic shape, broke the backbone of central authority, atomized the social order, and annihilated the ideological confidence of the ruling class. The legacy of this destruction defined the entire subsequent century. The republic that followed was immediately crippled by the same problems: warlordism funded by opium, an addicted populace, and a weak central state. The nationalist Kuomintang struggled with it. The ultimate success of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949 was partly rooted in its ruthless and effective suppression of the opium trade in the areas it controlled, positioning itself as the force that could finally cleanse the national humiliation and social decay that had begun 110 years earlier. Thus, the story of opium and the Qing is the story of how a civilization can be defeated without being conquered. The foreign powers did not seek to rule China from Beijing in the 19th century, they sought to render it pliable, profitable, and weak. In this, they succeeded utterly, using the poppy as their primary instrument. The greatest empire was destroyed not by being overthrown, but by being hollowed out. Its silver, its strength, its cohesion, and finally its soul, slowly smoked away into the waiting air. The spectral economy and the unmaking of a world. To conclude with the abdication of Puyi in 1912 is to miss the final, haunting truth of the opium trade's impact. Its most profound destruction was not of a political regime, but of a world system and the internal logic that sustained it. The Qing Empire was the last in a line of dynasties that operated within a sinocentric cosmological and economic order. Opium did not merely topple a government, it dismantled the very architecture of that order and forced China, traumatically and unwillingly, into the brutal paradigm of modern global capitalism. The empire was not just killed, its ontological foundation was erased. The end of the tributary cosmos. For millennia, China's relationship with the outside world was framed by the tributary system. This was not merely a foreign policy but a philosophical and spatial understanding of reality. The emperor, possessing the mandate of heaven, sat at the center of civilization Zhonghua, the Middle Kingdom. Outward radiated concentric circles of diminishing culture, first the Sinicized frontier, then tributary states Korea, Vietnam, Siam, the Ryukyus, and finally the outer barbarians the West. These barbarians could engage in trade, but only as a form of ritualistic submission, bringing tribute to the emperor's court in exchange for gifts of greater value, a ritual affirming the cosmic hierarchy. The opium trade, and the gunboat diplomacy that enforced it, shattered this cosmology into a knout geopolitical fact. The West did not come as supplicants bearing tribute. They came as sovereign equals, nay, as superiors, demanding treaties, legal jurisdiction, and territory under the principles of international law, a Western construct. The Treaty of Nanjing was not a tributary edict, it was a contract between nominally equal states, but one imposed by violence. The burning of the Summer Palace was more than an act of vandalism, it was a symbolic annihilation of the emperor's sacred, private nexus of cosmic power, proving that the barbarians could violate the innermost sanctum with impunity. This psychic shock cannot be overstated. The map of the world, once centered on the Forbidden City, was violently recentered on London, Paris, and Washington. China was demoted from the civilizational pivot to a semi-colony, a sick man of Asia, to be carved into spheres of influence. The opium trade was the tangible, addictive substance that made this abstract demotion a daily, degrading reality. Every opium den was a microcosm of the New World Order, a place where Chinese subjects paid for a product that enriched foreign powers and enslaved them to a foreign-induced need. The forced integration and distorted modernity. The Qing Empire was thus forcibly integrated into the global capitalist system, but in a profoundly distorted, dependent position. It became a classic example of what economists would later call a periphery economy, exporting primary goods tea, silk, and later, raw materials like tung oil and pig bristles to pay for imported manufactured goods and, most destructively, narcotics. Its economy was not modernized, it was extroverted and simplified to serve the core industrial nations. The infrastructure that developed around the treaty ports, Shanghai, Tianjin, Hankou, was not built for China's integrated development, but for the efficient extraction of its wealth and the insertion of foreign goods. Banks like the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, shipping lines, and insurance companies were established to service this lopsided exchange. A modern financial sector emerged, but it was headquartered in London and controlled by foreign boards. China developed a capitalist class, the compradors, who acted as intermediaries between foreign firms and the domestic market. This class gained wealth and some modern knowledge, but its interests were often aligned with foreign capital rather than national industrial development. The opium trade had birthed a parasitic bourgeoisie. This created a bizarre, dual economy. In the glittering Bund of Shanghai, one saw electric lights, telegraph wires, and modern banking. In the hinterlands, a peasantry crippled by opium addiction and punitive taxation tilled the land with ancient methods. There was no organic industrial revolution, because the capital surplus that might have funded it, the silver, had been siphoned off for decades, and what remained was hoarded or controlled by foreigners. The self-strengthening projects, like the Jiangnan arsenal, were impressive islands of modernity but were chronically underfunded, mismanaged, and disconnected from a supportive domestic economic ecosystem. They were symptoms of the distortion, not its cure. The poisoned legacy and the nationalist resurrection. The collapse of the Qing, therefore, did not resolve the crisis opium had initiated, it merely transformed it into the central problem of the Chinese Republic. The Republic of China 1912 to 1949 inherited a polity defined by the addictions of the previous century: fiscal addiction to opium revenue, political addiction to warlordism, and the social addiction of millions of citizens. The warlord era 1916 to 1928 was the direct, logical outcome of the late Qing's decentralization. Regional militarists like Zhang Zuolin in Manchuria or the Christian general Feng Yuxiong financed their armies and administrations through the opium trade. Poppy cultivation became a primary cash crop in regions they controlled. The Republican government in Beijing was often a powerless bystander, itself reliant on foreign loans secured against remaining state assets like the salt tax. Opium was no longer just a foreign import. It was the lifeblood of domestic militarism, the currency of fragmentation. This is why the most potent political movements of the 20th century, the nationalists Kuomintang and the communists, made opium suppression a cornerstone of their platforms. For them, the drug was the living symbol of national humiliation and weakness. Sun Yat-sen railed against it. Chiang Kai-shek's New Life movement in the 1930s included anti-opium campaigns, though they were often undermined by corruption and the Kuomintang's own occasional reliance on the traffic for funds. It was the Chinese Communist Party, in its base areas like Yangon, that pursued the most radical and effective suppression. They linked opium addiction directly to feudalism and imperialism, framing sobriety as a revolutionary act, a reclaiming of individual and national agency. Their success in eradicating the scourge from their territories after 1949 stands as one of their most significant and popular achievements, precisely because it finally closed a chapter of agony that had begun in the 1700s. Conclusion: the unquiet grave of history. How, then, did the opium trade destroy China's greatest empire? It did so physiologically, by addicting a critical mass of its population, sapping the labor force, and breaking families. It did so economically, by reversing the flow of silver, bankrupting the state, and forcing it into a toxic, self-cannibalizing dependency on the drug's revenue. It did so militarily, by revealing the dynasty's technological obsolescence and shattering its monopoly on violence, leading to the rise of private, regional armies. It did so politically, by eviscerating central authority, empowering provincial satraps and warlords, and making a mockery of imperial sovereignty through extraterritoriality. It did so socially, by fueling the despair and dislocation that exploded in history's bloodiest civil wars, the Taiping Rebellion being the prime example. And finally, it did so existentially, by demolishing the Sinocentric tributary worldview, exposing the impotence of Confucian orthodoxy, and forcing a traumatic re-evaluation of what China was and could be in a hostile, modern world. The Qing dynasty did not die of old age. It was not simply replaced by a more vibrant system. It was chemically dissolved. The opium trade was the solvent, aggressive, corrosive, and pervasive. It left behind not a clean slate for modernity, but a poisoned, fractured landscape from which a new China had to be painfully, violently, and meticulously resurrected. The memory of that century of humiliation, catalyzed by opium, became the foundational trauma of modern Chinese nationalism, fueling a drive for sovereignty, strength, and restoration that echoes powerfully to this day. The empire was gone, but the spectral pain of its unmaking, born in the poppy fields of Bengal and the smoking dens of Canton, would shape the destiny of a nation for centuries to come. The poppy's echo, cultural metamorphosis, and the afterimage of empire. The physical and institutional collapse of the Qing, as chronicled, is only the outermost layer of the catastrophe. To stop there is to miss the deeper, more insidious decay, the corrosion of cultural confidence, the transmutation of artistic and intellectual expression, and the birth of a pathological self-image that would haunt the Chinese psyche for generations. The opium trade did not just break an empire, it fractured a civilization's sense of its own soul, forcing a tortured introspection that played out in its literature, its art, and its very language. The aesthetics of decadence and the literary pipe dream. The 19th century witnessed a profound shift in the Chinese literary landscape, a move from the grand, scholarly idealism of the High Qing to a literature of anxiety, escapism, and grotesque realism. Opium became a central, ambiguous motif. On one hand, it fueled a culture of aestheticized decay among the literati. The opium den, with its darkened lounge and shared rituals, became a strangely intimate social space, a retreat from the unbearable pressures of a collapsing world. For some scholars and minor officials, the drug was romanticized as a conduit to artistic sensitivity and poetic reverie. Accounts describe users seeking the first chamber of exhilaration for composing verse or painting, followed by the second chamber of tranquil contemplation. This created a small but significant body of opium literature that aestheticized the experience, a parallel to the French decadent movement's fascination with absinthe and hashish. Yet, this was never a celebration of vitality, but a surrender to lassitude, a privileging of the dream over the waking reality of national humiliation. Conversely, and more powerfully, opium became the ultimate symbol of degradation in the emerging genre of exposure literature and social novels. The great novel The Travels of Lao Can 1904–1907 by Liu Yi, while not solely about opium, paints a panoramic picture of a sick society where good officials are powerless against systemic rot. Later, in the early Republican Mandarin Ducks and Butterflies popular fiction, the opium addict became a stock character, the wastrel son, the bankrupt merchant, the fallen woman, a moralistic symbol of family ruin. The most scathing indictments came from the May 4th movement writers of the 1910s and 1920s. For Lu Xun, China itself was a nation of spiritual addicts, slumbering in an iron house of tradition, needing the shock of modern thought to awaken. The physical addiction to opium served as his perfect metaphor for the psychological addiction to a suffocating past. The visual record, from imperial grandeur to caricature. The visual arc of the 19th century tells a parallel story of diminishing majesty. Early Qing portraiture presented emperors as serene, monumental Confucian sages or fierce, divine Manchu hunters. By the late 19th century, official portraits of the Guangxu Emperor or the Empress Dowager Cixi, while still formal, often seem brittle and anxious, their trappings of power appearing like costumes against a crumbling stage. More telling is the art produced outside the court. Export watercolors from Canton for the Western market often depicted the opium trade process, from the receiving ships to the bustling divans, with a neutral, documentary tone that normalized the scene. Meanwhile, satirical cartoons and illustrations in foreign publications like Punch or the Illustrated London News relentlessly caricatured the Chinese as pathetic, emaciated addicts with pigtails, lying stupefied next to their pipes. This imagery was a powerful tool of colonial ideology, justifying Western intervention as a necessary, if troubled, burden by portraying the Chinese as a race incapable of self-government, enslaved by their own vice. Perhaps the most poignant visual legacy is found in the few surviving photographs of opium dens from the late Qing and early Republic. These are not romanticized. They show figures collapsed in communal spaces, their bodies contorted in private oblivion, the air thick with a palpable despair. They are images of social death, a stark contrast to the vibrant, crowded street scenes of traditional Chinese painting. The camera, a Western invention, captured the human toll of the Western-induced plague with an unforgiving eye. The linguistic shift, the birth of a pathology. Language itself was reshaped by the crisis. New terms entered the lexicon, many carrying the stain of weakness and victimhood. Times Yang Yao, literally foreign medicine, the official euphemism for opium after its legalization. The term encapsulates the bitter irony, a poison dressed in the neutral guise of a pharmaceutical, its foreign origin always marked. Times Juin, the poison addiction. The concept of addiction was now explicitly linked not to a personal failing of moderation as with wine but to a physiological and moral poisoning from an external source. Times Bingfu, the sick man. Originally a self-critical term used by reformers, it was eagerly adopted by Western discourse as the sick man of Asia, a diagnostic label for the entire nation-state, seen as weak, effeminate, and diseased. Times Guokai, national humiliation. This became the overarching framework for understanding the century. The Opium Wars were the primal Guokai, a wound to the collective body politic that demanded perpetual remembrance and, eventually, redemption. This linguistic shift was crucial. It moved the discourse from the realm of imperial diplomacy tribute, barbarian management to the realm of national pathology addiction, sickness, Humiliation. China was no longer discussing how to manage outsiders, but how to cure itself. The spiritual void and the search for new gods. The failure of the Confucian order to protect the realm created a profound spiritual vacuum. If the rights and principles that had sustained civilization for millennia could not stop the foreign devils and their poison, what was their value? This crisis of faith opened the door to radical alternatives. Christian missionary activity, protected by the Unequal Treaties, saw a significant, if complex, increase. For some Chinese, particularly among the poor and marginalized, Christianity offered a new cosmology of salvation, discipline, and a connection to the source of Western power. The Taiping Rebellion, with its perverted Protestant theology, was the most catastrophic and extreme example of this search for a new spiritual template. More consequentially, the late Qing and early Republican period saw an unprecedented influx of Western political thought, social Darwinism, liberalism, anarchism, and finally, Marxism. These were not just political theories, they were soteriological systems, secular religions offering diagnoses for China's sickness and blueprints for its resurrection. Social Darwinism explained the humiliation. China was losing the struggle for survival. Marxism provided a more satisfying, systemic analysis. China was a semi-colonial society exploited by imperialist capitalism, of which the opium trade was the purest, earliest form. The communist victory can be seen, in part, as the ultimate selection of a new faith robust enough to explain the century of pain and promise a path to purity and power. Epilogue: the long shadow in the modern mind. The destruction, therefore, was total. The opium trade did not just topple a political structure, it dismantled the cultural ecosystem that gave that structure meaning. It turned art inward to escapism or critique, it reshaped language around concepts of disease and shame, and it shattered the spiritual orthodoxy, leaving a void filled by competing, often militant, modern ideologies. The modern Chinese state's obsession with sovereignty, its deep-seated suspicion of foreign influence in cultural and ideological spheres, and its relentless drive for national rejuvenation are direct descendants of this trauma. The century of humiliation is not just a historical period taught in schools. It is a living memory, a collective neurosis whose origin story begins with the opium chests being unloaded at Whampoa. When we speak of the opium trade destroying China's greatest empire, we must finally understand that the empire was more than land, silver, and institutions. It was a coherent universe of meaning, a universe where the emperor mediated heaven and earth, where the scholar's brush upheld moral order, and where all under heaven knew their place. The opium trade, and the forces it unleashed, reduced that universe to smoke and ash. What arose from the ashes was a modern nation-state, hardened by suffering, driven by the memory of its own dissolution, and forever marked by the spectral imprint of the poppy. The greatest empire was not just overthrown, its entire way of seeing the world was rendered obsolete, leaving behind a people condemned, and ultimately determined, to reinvent themselves in a new, unforgiving age. The unhealing scar, memory, mythology, and the geopolitics of resentment. The physical empire is gone. The last addicts of the High Qing era have long since turned to dust. Yet, the destruction wrought by opium persists, not as an active toxin, but as a psychic scar tissue that has hardened into national bone. The event is over, the memory has become a monument. To understand the opium trade's ultimate destruction is to see how it birthed a historical consciousness so powerful, so ingrained, that it now shapes the very reflexes of a global power. From historical trauma to national mythology. The Chinese Communist Party, upon its 1949 victory, performed two acts of historical alchemy concerning opium. First, it executed a genuinely unprecedented social feat, the rapid, ruthless, and effective eradication of the drug from mainland China. Addicts were compelled into rehabilitation, dealers were executed, the cycle of addiction that had crippled generations for 150 years was severed within a few years. This was a profound physical catharsis. Second, and with equal force, the party enshrined the opium narrative as the foundational trauma of modern Chinese history. It was codified in textbooks, memorialized in museums. The Opium War Museum in Human is a temple to this memory, and dramatized in countless films and propaganda pieces. In this official narrative, the story is sharpened into a stark morality play. A vibrant, self-sufficient civilization is deliberately poisoned by rapacious Western imperialists with the British as chief villains. A weak and corrupt feudal dynasty, the Qing, proves incapable of defending the nation, and only the eventual rise of the Communist Party, representing the awakened will of the people, could expel the foreign poison, redeem the national humiliation decay, and restore sovereignty. This is more than history, it is a state-sponsored mythology. It creates a clean, causal arc from 1840 to 1949, establishing the party not merely as a political successor, but as the savior from a century-long national agony it did not cause but definitively ended. The trauma is thus made purposeful. It becomes the founding wound that legitimizes the current regime's authority and its insistence on unity, strength, and vigilance against external influence. The instrument of geopolitics, the century of humiliation as diplomatic grammar. This cultivated memory is not locked in the past. It is a living, active grammar in contemporary Chinese foreign policy and national discourse. References to the century of humiliation are not merely historical observations, they are potent rhetorical tools. Times the sovereignty argument. Any perceived infringement on Chinese territorial integrity, whether regarding Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, or the South China Sea, is instinctively framed through the lens of this historical trauma. The message is, we have known the agony of dismemberment and foreign control. We will never allow it again. This transforms geopolitical disputes from legal or strategic issues into visceral tests of national redemption. Times the narrative of resistance. The story emphasizes Chinese victimhood but also Chinese resilience. It fosters a national self-image not as a passive sufferer, but as a civilization that has endured the worst the West could inflict and has emerged stronger. This fuels a deep-seated skepticism of Western moralizing on human rights or governance, seen as a modern echo of the hypocritical civilizing mission that once justified the opium trade. Times the legitimacy of power. The memory of helplessness against foreign gunboats is invoked to justify the relentless modernization of the People's Liberation Army. Military parades showcasing advanced hardware are not just shows of force, they are ritualistic exorcisms of the ghost of the nemesis, spectacles meant to demonstrate that the era of being bullied is gone forever. In this way, the opium trade continues to destroy in a meta-historical sense. It forecloses certain modes of interaction, predisposing the Sino-Western relationship to one shadowed by deep historical suspicion. It creates a psychological framework where compromise can be seen as a prelude to submission, and where national strength is the sole non-negotiable imperative. The counter-memory and the unresolved questions. Yet, like all powerful national myths, this narrative suppresses complicating counter-memories. The official story downplays the domestic complicities that made the trade so devastating, the entrepreneurial zeal of Chinese smugglers, the systemic corruption of the Qing bureaucracy, the regional governors who profited, and the later warlords who funded their armies with poppy taxes. To fully acknowledge this is to admit that the poison was not purely external, it found fertile ground in internal decay. This remains a delicate historical nerve. Furthermore, the focus on Western imperialists can obscure the complex role of other Asian actors, from Indian producers to Parsi and Armenian traders, within the global narcotics network. And within China itself, the memory of opium's social wreckage lives on in familial folklore, stories of great-grandfathers who lost the family land to the pipe, often carrying a more ambiguous shame that the state's heroic national narrative seeks to override. A fractured sense of time. Perhaps the most profound and subtle destruction lies in the realm of historical consciousness itself. For pre-Opium War China, history was cyclical, a procession of dynasties rising and falling according to the mandate of heaven. Time was a wheel. The opium crisis shattered that wheel and replaced it with an arrow. It created a catastrophic rupture between a before and an after, imposing a linear, traumatic timeline of decline, crisis, and struggle. This rupture created what scholar Wang Hui terms the short 20th century in China, a century of endless, frantic modernity seeking that began not in 1900, but in the 1840s. The empire's destruction forced China into a new, Western-dominated temporal order, where progress was measured by industrial might and national power. The serene, retrospective gaze of the Confucian scholar was replaced by the anxious, future-oriented urgency of the revolutionary and the reformer. The empire's destruction, thus, was also the destruction of its way of inhabiting time. Conclusion: the empire as ghost. The Qing dynasty is gone. But it haunts the present as a ghostly negative image, a warning, a lesson, a source of perpetual grievance and unwavering resolve. The opium trade was the event that turned a living empire into this potent ghost. It was the scalpel that dissected a civilization, revealing weaknesses, forcing impossible choices, and setting in motion a chain of consequences, political, social, cultural, and psychological, that have yet to fully play out. The destruction was not an event, but a process, not a single death, but a long metamorphosis into something harder and more determined. Today, when a Chinese diplomat speaks of national sovereignty and territorial integrity, when a naval vessel is launched, when a schoolchild visits the Opium War Museum, the ghost of the Qing is there. It is there in the unyielding stance, in the pride of technological mastery, in the quiet shame of the historical exhibit. The greatest empire was destroyed so thoroughly that its memory became the bedrock upon which a new, formidable, and profoundly historically conscious power was built. The poppy's true legacy, therefore, may not be the empire it killed, but the relentless, wounded, and resolute nation-state it helped, in its terrible, circuitous way, to create. The echo of its destruction is now woven into the fabric of the 21st century, a silent, shaping vibration in the rise of China and its fraught re-engagement with the world. The shadow in the mirror, opium, historiography, and the modern Chinese psyche. The narrative of the opium trade and the fall of the Qing is not merely a story about China, it is a story that has been told and retold, becoming a mirror held up to the nation itself. The reflection in that mirror changes, revealing as much about the storyteller and the moment of telling as it does about the historical events. This final chapter explores how the memory of this destruction has been weaponized, contested, internalized, and ultimately, how it has sculpted the modern Chinese identity at its most intimate and collective levels. The empire's fall is complete, but the struggle over its meaning is an eternal present. The battle for the past, competing historiographies. The history of the opium trade is a battlefield of interpretations, each serving a different vision of China's past and future. Times the nationalist Kuomintang narrative. Before 1949, the nationalist narrative focused on the weakness and corruption of the Manchu Qing, a foreign dynasty, and the heroic resistance of Han Chinese figures like Lin Zexu. It emphasized the need for a strong, modern, unified republic to overcome the legacy of feudal incompetence and foreign predation. This was a story of Han national rejuvenation against both Manchu rule and Western imperialism. Times the Marxist-Maoist orthodoxy. The Communist Party refined and radicalized this. Here, the Qing's failure is inevitable, the result of the feudal class system. The real villains are the trinity of feudalism, imperialism, and bureaucrat capitalism. The opium trade is the primary vehicle through which imperialism hooked its claws into China, distorting its economy and creating a comprador class as its domestic agents. This narrative elevates the struggle to a scientific, historical inevitability, with the Communist Party as the dialectical outcome, the vanguard of the oppressed masses finally breaking both feudal chains and imperialist shackles. Times the New Qing History Challenge, emerging from Western and some diaspora scholarship in the late 20th century, this school deliberately challenged nationalist and Marxist frames. It emphasized the Qing as a successful early modern Eurasian empire, with the Manchus as a distinct, conquering elite who strategically managed a vast, multi-ethnic domain. From this view, the Opium Wars were not the beginning of China's modern tragedy, but the moment a confident, expansionist empire ran into the even more powerful, industrialized empire of the West. This relativizes the humiliation, framing it as a geopolitical collision rather than a civilizational sin. Within China, this view is often seen as an attempt to dilute the narrative of victimhood and undermine the unity of the Chinese nation-state. Times the liberal critique, a quieter, dissident strand of thought, often suppressed, focuses on the institutional and cultural failures within Chinese society that allowed the crisis to reach such a scale. It asks uncomfortable questions about the rigidity of the Confucian examination system, the absence of mechanisms for institutional innovation, and the deep-seated corruption that rotted the state from within. This narrative suggests the poison was as much endogenous as exogenous, a critique of authoritarianism and closed systems that resonates with some modern reformers. The communist state, as the victor in the Civil War and custodian of national memory, has aggressively promoted its Marxist nationalist synthesis. It actively polices this historiographical battlefield, censoring views like aspects of New Qing history that threaten the unifying, legitimizing power of the official trauma narrative. The internalized scar, the psychological legacy. Beyond politics, the opium catastrophe seeped into the collective unconscious, shaping a series of deep-seated, and often contradictory, psychological complexes. Times the victimhood vigilance complex, a profound sense of historical victimization coexists with a hypervigilance against any sign of its repetition. This creates a public and official psyche that is simultaneously proud and profoundly sensitive, quick to perceive slights or conspiracies. The widespread public fury that can erupt over perceived foreign insults, e.g., NATO's bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, certain editorial cartoons, is not just state-manufactured, it taps into this genuine, deep-seated reservoir of historical grievance. Times the humiliation redemption drive. The shame of the sick man has been transformed into an immense, collective drive for redemption through achievement. This fuels everything from the obsession with Olympic gold medals proving physical superiority to the national pride in technological firsts like high-speed rail or lunar exploration. Each success is experienced not just as progress, but as a brick laid in the reconstruction of national dignity, a psychic repayment of a 150-year-old debt of humiliation. Times the superiority-inferiority dialectic. This is the most psychologically fraught legacy. China's ancient self-image as the central kingdom, morally and culturally superior, was shattered by military defeat. The result is a persistent, anxious dialectic, a deeply held belief in China's unique civilizational greatness, perpetually tested against and sometimes feeling belied by the need to catch up to and beat the West at its own game of technological and material power. This creates a tension between asserting cultural distinctiveness and craving universal recognition on Western-defined terms. The ghost in the global machine, China's international relations. This historical psyche directly informs China's behavior on the world stage today. Its foreign policy can be read as a sustained project to ensure the conditions of the century of humiliation can never recur. Times the core of core interests. China's definition of its core interests is exceptionally broad and non-negotiable, encompassing not only sovereignty over territory but also political system security and regime stability. This expansive view is a direct reaction to the incremental, piecemeal dismemberment of sovereignty it experienced in the 19th century, first a treaty port, then an island, then legal jurisdiction, then spheres of influence. Times the Belt and Road Initiative as anti-humiliation, while driven by economic and strategic goals, the BRI also has a powerful psychological dimension. It is the precise inversion of the opium trade era. Instead of foreign gunboats forcing open Chinese ports for the extraction of wealth, it is Chinese capital and engineering opening ports and building infrastructure abroad to shape connectivity on its own terms. It represents a move from passive object to active subject in the global system. Times the discourse of win-win versus zero-sum, Chinese diplomacy tirelessly promotes win-win cooperation and rejects a Cold War mentality. This rhetoric is, in part, a deliberate distancing from the predatory, extractive, zero-sum imperialism it experienced. It positions China as the author of a new, more just global paradigm, even as its actions are often viewed with deep suspicion by others who see echoes of older imperial behaviors. The living monument, memory in the digital age. Today, the memory of the Opium Wars is curated and contested with new tools. The national humiliation narrative is amplified through state media, blockbuster patriotic films The Opium War, The Burning of Yuan, and online history education. Social media platforms become arenas where nationalist youth, steeped in this narrative, confront foreign critics and domestic dissenters alike. Museums like the one in Human are not passive archives. They are immersive, emotional experiences designed to induce a visceral reaction. Visitors walk past lifelike dioramas of emaciated addicts, see the reconstructed trenches where Lin Zexu destroyed the opium, and confront massive, rusting anchors of British warships pulled from the river. It is history as cathartic theatre. Yet, the digital age also allows for muted countercurrents. In private chats, in the work of novelists and artists operating at the edges of acceptability, more ambivalent and personal explorations of this history persist, stories that dwell on the moral ambiguities, the family tragedies, and the complex legacies that the official monumentalism cannot contain. The destruction that built a nation. So, how did the opium trade destroy China's greatest empire? It did so not with a single cut, but with a million points of infection, in the body, the treasury, the bureaucracy, the social bond, the artistic spirit, and the cosmological map. But in a terrible, paradoxical alchemy, that very destruction became the crucible for a new form of Chinese polity. The utter dismantling of the old order, its assumptions, its confidence, its isolation, made possible and necessary the construction of a modern nation-state defined by its resistance to that dismantling. The trauma became the seed of identity, the humiliation, the fuel for ambition, the memory of fragmentation, the imperative for unity. The Qing Empire is dead. But its ghost, conjured by the poppy, walks the halls of power in Beijing, stalks the decks of aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, and whispers in the ear of every Chinese diplomat at an international forum. It is a ghost that commands, never again. In ensuring that this command is obeyed, modern China has built itself, in part, as a living fortress against its own past. Thus, the ultimate destruction wrought by the opium trade may be this. It condemned China to a perpetual, vigilant future, forever looking over its shoulder at the long, dissipating smoke of its own greatest empire's funeral pyre. The past is not past. It is the foundation upon which the present anxiously and resolutely stands. The eternal cycle, the poppy's final lesson and the unanswered echo. To declare an ending is to impose a false stillness upon history. The story of opium and the Qing does not conclude. It reverberates, mutates, and demands a final, unsettling reflection on the nature of power, vulnerability, and historical memory itself. We have traced the poison through the body, the state, the culture, and the psyche. Now, we must step back to witness the pattern it etched into the cosmos of Chinese history. A pattern that speaks not just of China's past, but of a cyclical, haunting dynamic in human affairs. The poppy as a prism for universal dynamics. The opium crisis, in its terrifying specificity, illuminates universal historical truths. 1. The vulnerability of equilibrium. The High Qing represented a pinnacle of pre-industrial equilibrium, a vast, self-regulating system of agriculture, bureaucracy, and ideology. The opium trade demonstrated how such a complex, finely tuned system could be catastrophically unbalanced by a novel, external vector acting on a critical pressure point, in this case, silver and human neurochemistry. It is a case study in systemic collapse. 2. The moral vacuum of progress. The British Empire rationalized the trade through the immoral logic of global capitalism and free market rhetoric. The Chinese Empire resisted it through a moralistic, Confucian language of social harmony and vice. Their collision was not just of armies, but of irreconcilable moral universes. The Opium Wars stand as a grim monument to the reality that what one civilization calls progress or trade can be experienced by another as existential violence and moral corruption. 3. The afterlife of trauma. The Qing's destruction shows that a civilization's response to trauma can become its defining characteristic for centuries. The wound, more than the original healthy body, shapes the organism's future growth. China's modern identity, its drive, its suspicion, its immense pride shadowed by a memory of shame, is a scar formation of monumental proportions. The unanswered echo, opium's shadow in the 21st century. The ghost of the poppy is not confined to history books or nationalist rhetoric. It manifests in subtle, contemporary resonances. Times the opium of the people reversed. Marx famously called religion the opium of the people. In modern China, the state vigilantly guards against any ideological or spiritual force it perceives as a similar soporific, a distraction from national purpose or a threat to social control. The war on opium has metaphorically extended into a war on any influence seen as weakening collective resolve or promoting spiritual pollution. Times the new unequal treaties rhetoric. When China faces intense trade pressure or technology sanctions from the West, state media and officials will sometimes invoke the language of new unequal treaties or century-old bullying tactics. The historical analogy may be imprecise, but its emotional and political potency is immense, framing current disputes as a recurrence of an ancient pattern of suppression. Times the pharmaceutical parallel. Today, the West faces its own epidemic of opioid addiction, fueled by corporate greed, regulatory failure, and societal despair. From a Chinese perspective, this carries a bitter historical irony. It allows for a narrative of role reversal, where China, having purged itself of its narcotic plague through iron discipline, now watches a morally lecturing West succumb to a similar demon of its own making. This feeds a narrative of civilizational ascendance and historical justice. The cycle of empire, a final, sobering reflection. The rise and fall of the Qing, catalyzed by opium, fits into a broader, melancholy cycle observable in the histories of many great empires. 1. Ascendancy, confidence, expansion, cultural flowering, and a belief in the uniqueness and permanence of one's order. 2. Stasis, bureaucratic rigidity, the calcification of innovation, a growing gap between elite and populace, and a belief that the existing model is eternally sufficient. 3. The catalytic shock, an external or internal force, a new technology, a climatic shift, a pandemic, or a novel commodity like opium, exploits the system's hidden vulnerabilities with devastating speed. 4. The unraveling. The shock exposes the internal rot. The system's response is too slow, too corrupt, or too ideologically hidebound. Decentralization, rebellion, and loss of legitimacy accelerate. 5. The metamorphosis. The old form collapses, but its constituent parts, its people, its land, its memories, are reassembled into something new, often defined in opposition to the causes of the collapse. The Qing completed this cycle. The opium trade was its catalytic shock. The modern People's Republic is its metamorphosis, a polity forged in the fire of that unraveling, determined to break the cycle at the point of stasis and vulnerability. Conclusion: not an end, but a perpetual vigil. Therefore, the story of how the opium trade destroyed China's greatest empire is not a closed chapter. It is an open lesson, a wound that breathes. The physical empire of the Qing is dust. But the historical consciousness it bequeathed, a consciousness of splendid isolation shattered, of humiliation endured, and of a redemption eternally under construction, is more powerful than any wall the Ming or Qing ever built. The final destruction was not of a political entity alone, but of innocence. It destroyed the Chinese world's ability to believe in its own immutable centrality. In its place, it installed a relentless, anxious engine of national restoration, powered by the memory of its own dismemberment. The poppy's final lesson is this: history's most potent forces are often not the grand ideologies or the great leaders, but the humble, psychoactive commodities that travel along trade routes, bypassing armies and diplomats to whisper directly to the pleasure and pain centers of a population. In doing so, they can unravel the most intricate tapestries of power and culture. The British did not set out to destroy Chinese civilization, they set out to balance a trade ledger. Yet, in pursuing that narrow goal with a biological weapon of mass addiction, they triggered a chain of consequences that dismantled a world and shaped the defiant, complex superpower of today. The echo will never fade. It is in the steel of China's warships and the silicon of its firewalls. It is in the fervor of its patriots and the caution of its diplomats. The empire is gone, but the long, slow burn of its destruction still illuminates and warms and warns the nation that was born from its ashes. The vigilance is perpetual. The lesson, eternal.